On a launch pad at Baikonur, in the flat desert of Kazakhstan, a rocket stands ready to carry a man around the moon. It's early December 1968. A crew has been named, and the men are at the cosmodrome. The launch window is open, but the order to fly never comes. 3 weeks later, on the morning of December 21st, 3 Americans lifted off aboard Apollo 8 and flew to the moon. And the country that had launched the first satellite and the first man wouldn't be the one to send a human there. I want to tell you how that happened, because it may be the most consequential failure in the history of spaceflight, and because the story is rarely told in its entirety. The usual version is that the Soviets lost the moon because their giant rocket kept blowing up, and America was simply better. That version is wrong, or at least so incomplete that it becomes wrong. For most of the space age, the Soviet Union wasn't behind, it was ahead, at nearly every step, and the last real chance it had to reach the moon first slipped away in about 6 weeks at the end of 1968. There was no panic, and no single fatal explosion. What happened instead was a long run of decisions, every one of them made by competent people, and every one reasonable on the day it was made. Nobody here is the villain, and that's exactly what makes it worth your time. Begin with how high they were standing, because the drop only means something from up there. The Soviet Union put the first artificial satellite into orbit in October 1957, and the beeping of Sputnik over American cities did more to start the space race than any speech. 2 years later, a Soviet probe became the first object to reach the surface of the moon, and a second one sent home the first photographs of its far side, a hemisphere no human had ever seen. In April 1961, they launched the first man into space. In 1965, one of their cosmonauts became the first human to leave a spacecraft and float free in the vacuum. In early 1966, they set the first probe down softly on the moon, and weeks later put the first machine into orbit around it. And in September 1968, a craft called Zond 5 looped around the moon and came home, and inside it were 2-step tortoises, the first living creatures from Earth to make that journey and return alive. Those tortoises matter. I'll come back to them. I think that run of firsts is the thing that hides the real story, because it looks like dominance, and it was something more fragile than that. The Soviet space program in those years ran on a particular kind of genius, and the genius belonged largely to one man, Sergei Korolev, the chief designer whose name was a state secret while he lived. He improvised. He worked around shortages of money and industry the Americans never had to think about, and he scored one first after another by being bolder and quicker than anyone expected. That was a superb way to lead the early space age. Firsts reward audacity, a clever adaptation, a willingness to fly before the other side is ready. From the standpoint of leading the space age, that structure was a strength. From the standpoint of landing a human being on the moon and bringing him back, it was a catastrophic weakness, because a moon landing isn't a stunt you improvise. It's a decade-long industrial mobilization, and it rewards the opposite qualities: patience, money, and a single unified command. The Soviet program had none of those three when it needed them, and the reasons it didn't are the whole story. The trouble started with time, and time is the one thing you can't buy back. When Kennedy committed the United States to landing on the moon in 1961, the Soviet leadership didn't answer. Khrushchev wasn't especially interested in racing there. His attention was on intercontinental missiles, on the warheads and the rockets to carry them, because the Soviet Union was strategically behind and a moon program did nothing for that. Given where the country actually stood in the early 1960s, choosing the deterrent over the moon was rational, maybe the only responsible call. But it meant the Soviet Union didn't formally commit to a crewed lunar landing until Khrushchev signed off on the plan in August 1964, more than 3 years after Kennedy, more than 3 years after Apollo had begun pulling together its money and its people. The Americans spent those years building hardware. On the Soviet side, those same years went to deciding whether to compete at all. And in a race that would be settled by the end of the decade, a 3-year head start, handed to the other side, was very close to the whole contest, before the real work had even begun. And once the decision was finally made, the effort was never one effort. It was split among rival design bureaus that fought each other for the same money and the same mission, almost as hard as they fought America. Korolev wanted the landing. So did a rival named Chelomey, who won approval from the Politburo to develop a competing giant moon rocket of his own. A second booster for a country that could barely fund one. 2 design empires, 2 rockets, a single prize, and never enough money for either. And the deepest split was over the engines. The The finest rocket engine designer in the country was Valentin Glishko, and Glishko and Korolev had come to despise each other. They disagreed about propellant, and it was a real technical fight, not a tantrum. Glishko built engines that burned storable chemicals, the kind that ignite the instant they touch, and he argued the cryogenic fuels Korolev wanted couldn't be developed in time with the resources they had. Korolev thought Glishko's chemicals were too toxic and too dangerous to put a crew on. Each man was defending a serious engineering position, but the result was that Glishko wouldn't build the engines for Korolev's moon rocket, and the job went instead to Nikolai Kuznetsov, a brilliant designer of jet engines who had never built a rocket engine in his life. Kuznetsov's engines were small, and a moon rocket needs colossal thrust, so the first stage of the N1 ended up carrying 30 of them, arranged in rings, more engines clustered together than on any rocket ever flown. And here's the trap in that number. There was no facility anywhere in the program that could fire all 30 together on the ground before flight, and no money to build one, so the full first stage was never once tested as a whole until it was actually lifting off. The engineers ran a couple of engines out of each batch, checked them, and trusted the rest. The Americans, by contrast, could fire their engines fully before they were ever bolted to a Saturn. So the Soviet moon rocket went to the pad each time as a machine whose central system had never been proven, and everyone involved half expected it to fail, because there was no other way left to find the flaws except to fly. I still find that hard to get my head around, the most powerful rocket anyone had built, and nobody had ever switched its engines on all at once until the day it was carrying the whole program with it. Then, in January 1966, the one loss that could never be undone. Korolev went into a Moscow hospital for a procedure that was supposed to be minor. He was 59. The accounts of what killed him differ. The government called it a cancerous tumor. Glishko said later it was a hemorrhoid operation that went wrong. There's an account that he began to bleed on the table, and the surgeons couldn't get a breathing tube into him because his jaw had been broken years earlier in the Gulag and had never healed right. Whatever the true cause, the one man who'd held the whole program together, who had the political weight to force the bureaus into line and the standing to get what he needed from the Kremlin, was gone. The work passed to his deputy, Vasily Mishin, a capable engineer who didn't have his old boss's authority and couldn't manufacture it. A late start is survivable, in principle. The death of the one man the whole structure depended on was not. I've come to think that hospital in Moscow is where the moon was actually lost, almost 3 years before Apollo 8, and long before anyone in the program would have said so out loud. And underneath all of it was money, and the lack of it. The United States, at the peak of Apollo, was spending something like 4% of the entire federal budget on the moon, and employing around 400,000 people to get there. The Soviet Union never made a commitment anywhere near that, and it never made it because the men who controlled the budget didn't believe the moon was worth it. The defense minister, Marshal Malinowski, put it about as plainly as a man can. "We cannot afford to, and will not," he said, "build super-powerful launch vehicles and carry out flights to the moon." That wasn't cowardice, and it wasn't stupidity. It was a judgment that the country's scarce resources belonged in its missiles, and inside the logic of the Cold War you can follow the reasoning. But it left a program that was already late, already divided, and now leaderless with never quite enough. And the arithmetic of that is the part I find hardest to sit with, harder than any of the men in it. Never enough for a proper engine test stand, never enough for a second launch pad, never enough to do the thing the way it needed doing. Every one of those choices was reasonable on its own. Together they were fatal, and by the second half of 1968, the bill was coming due. So let me be honest about what that actually meant, because it's the heart of the whole thing. There's a comfortable version of December 1968, in which the Soviets had a working moonship on the pad and simply lost their nerve at the last moment, and that version is false. The truth is harder. The circumlunar spacecraft, the Zond, was a stripped-down Soyuz launched on a proton rocket, and it was meant to carry 2 cosmonauts on a loop around the moon and back. The problem was that it had never once come home in a state a human being could have survived. Zond 5, the flight with the tortoises, made it around the moon and back to Earth, but a guidance failure sent it plunging in on a steep path that hammered its passengers with crushing force and dropped it into the Indian Ocean, far from anyone who could quickly reach it. Then in November came Zond 6. It rounded the moon, and on the way home a seal failed, and the cabin lost its air hours before re-entry, killing everything aboard, and then the parachute lines were cut while the capsule was still more than 3 miles up, and it hit the ground in Kazakhstan at killing speed. A crew on that flight would have died twice over, once from the vacuum and once from the impact. That's the part I keep coming back to. A crewed flight had even been penciled in for around December 8th to loop the moon 2 weeks ahead of Apollo 8. In early December, with the window open and Apollo 8 already stacked and waiting in Florida, the Soviet cosmonauts were ready. The men in line to fly, Alexei Leonov, the first human ever to walk in space, and Oleg Makarov, beside him, were at the cosmodrome, and by the accounts drawn from the diaries of the officer who ran cosmonaut training, they were willing to take the risk and push to be allowed to go. What they were asking to ride was the Proton, a powerful new rocket that had never been cleared to carry people and had a launch record too spotty to trust with a life, and on top of it, a spacecraft that had just killed its own passengers on its last flight home, and the State Commission said no. Given everything, that was the correct decision, and it was the humane one. A little over 18 months earlier, a cosmonaut named Vladimir Komarov had died when the parachute on his new spacecraft failed and he fell from the sky, the first man ever lost in the course of a spaceflight. And nobody in that room wanted to sign off on doing it again to win a date on a calendar. So they kept the rocket on the ground. And this is what the 6 weeks really show you. The race for the first humans to the moon wasn't lost on December 21st, when Apollo 8 lifted off. It was already gone, and it was gone in the structure of the thing. They had the crew, the rocket on the pad, and the open window. What they didn't have, the only thing that mattered, was a ship that had ever come home safe, and no decision made in December could conjure one, because 6 weeks isn't enough time to build what 4 years of a late, divided, starved program had failed to build. When Apollo 8's crew read from the Book of Genesis in orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve, the outcome had been settled years before, by a run of choices that no single person in the chain had gotten wrong. You'd think that would be the end of it, that once the first humans had reached the moon, the Soviets would quietly walk away. They didn't. They kept going, and this is where the story stops being about the loop around the moon and becomes about the landing itself, and the giant rocket built to make it. After Apollo 8, and even after Apollo 11 actually landed in July 1969, the Soviet Union kept launching the N-1, the moon rocket with the 30 engines, still reaching for a landing the world had already watched someone else make. And I don't think that was foolish, exactly. There was an argument that the program had come too far and cost too much to abandon, and that the engineering really was improving, being beaten into shape by trial and error, the hard and expensive way. It failed anyway, 4 times, and none of the failures were the heroic kind. The first N-1 launched in February 1969, and its engine control system shut the whole stage down about a minute into the flight. The second launched that July, days before Apollo 11, and as it cleared the tower, an engine failed and the control system shut down all but one of the rest, and the rocket settled back onto its own launch pad with something like 2,500 tons of propellant aboard. The blast was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions human beings have ever made. It flattened the launch complex and threw wreckage for miles, and it meant that in the same weeks Americans were walking on the moon, the Soviet moon rocket had destroyed the place it was supposed to fly from. Rebuilding took 2 years. 2 more went up, in 1971 and 1972, and both tore apart in the first minutes. 4 rockets, 4 failures, and not one of them ever reached space. And there was a legitimate argument, running underneath the whole time, that they should stop. The race was over, the money was needed elsewhere, and the rocket had never once worked. That case was defensible, and its effect was to keep eroding what political support the program had left. In the end, it didn't die in an explosion or a grand decision. In May 1974, Machine was pushed out and replaced as head of the program by Valentin Glushko, the same engine designer who'd refused to build for it years before. And Glushko, on taking over, simply canceled it. The remaining rockets were broken up, the hardware was scrapped or hidden away. And for years afterward, the Soviet Union denied there had been a crewed moon program at all, insisting nobody had ever been trying to send a person there. A story that held until the openness of the late 1980s finally let the truth out. It didn't end with a bang. It ended with a change of management and a cover story. So let me be direct about why they lost. Strip it all back, and the reasons come to 4. The first, and the largest, is timing. The program committed years after its competitor, and in a race with a hard deadline at the end of the decade, those lost years couldn't be bought back with money the program never had anyway. You cannot start a race this long 3 years late and expect to finish first, and no amount of later effort changed that. The second is division. Where the United States ran one program under one agency, the Soviet effort was split among rival bureaus fighting each other for the same money and the same prize. The feud between Korolev and Glushko alone forced a first stage of 30 engines that couldn't be fired together on the ground before flight, because there was no facility to do it and no money to build one. An effort divided against itself spends much of its strength fighting itself instead of the problem. The third is money, which sits under the other two. The Soviet leadership never funded the moon at anything like the American scale, because the men who held the budget judged the country's resources belonged in its missiles. You can argue that judgment was right for the country. It was still fatal to the moon, because a decade-long industrial mobilization cannot be run on what's left after the missile budget takes its share. And the fourth reason is the honorable one, and it's the one that hurts. When the moment finally came, the people in charge wouldn't put a human crew on an unproven rocket, on top of a spacecraft that had just failed fatally, to win a milestone by a few weeks. That was the right thing to do, the decent thing to do, and it meant they didn't fly. None of these men was a fool, and none of them was a coward. Korolev built the space program of a nation nearly from nothing and died before he could finish the one thing he wanted most. Kuznetsov took on an engine he'd never designed before and built something remarkable under impossible constraints. Mishin inherited a program he couldn't save and took the blame for losing it. Leonov and the other cosmonauts were ready to strap themselves to a rocket that might well have killed them, and were told no by men trying to keep them alive. Every one of them was doing his job well inside the constraints he was handed. The deeper lesson, I think, is that they lost because a program built to score firsts on audacity ran into a goal that couldn't be improvised. Everything that made the Soviet Union the leader of the early space age, the boldness, the willingness to fly first, the brilliant workarounds by a handful of extraordinary people, was the wrong toolkit for a moon landing, which needed the boring things instead. An early start, unified command, and enormous sustained money. A moon landing went to whoever treated it as a decade-long industrial mobilization. The Soviet program was never allowed to be that, and the arithmetic was visible years before December 1968. The 6 weeks at the end of the year weren't where the race was lost, they were only where the loss finally became impossible to hide. The cosmodrome at Baikonur is still there, still launching, and much of what flies from it descends from the engineering of exactly these people. The rocket that lifts crews to the space station today traces its family line straight back to Korolev's designs. The Soyuz spacecraft still flies, more than half a century on. The country that built all of it is gone, and the one that followed inherited the launch pads and the lineage, but no Soviet, and no Russian after them, has ever walked on the moon, or flown around it, or reached it at all. Not because the engineers weren't good enough. They were among the best who ever lived. It was because the country never built the program those engineers needed, and by the time that was clear, the window had already closed. In a hall at the Moscow Aviation Institute, students walk past a spacecraft most of them barely glance at. It's small, built for a single man, with no tunnel to climb through, so the one cosmonaut who was to fly it would have had to spacewalk across open space to reach it, drop to the moon alone, and climb back out alone. It flew 3 times without a crew, in Earth orbit, and every one of those flights went well. It was judged ready. It's a working moon lander that never had a working rocket to carry it, and no human ever rode it anywhere. The only creatures from Earth the Soviet Union ever sent around the moon and brought home alive were 2 tortoises, in the autumn of 1968. The men who trained to follow them never went. If a program that led the world and still lost is the kind of story you want more of, the space age is full of them. Scrapped and classified and quietly denied, and I dig them out and tell them the way the record actually reads. Subscribe and there will always be another one waiting for you.